started with this. I wanted to welcome everybody. This is another installment in our information management series. This is Making Sense of the Regulatory Alphabet Soup. I also wanted to mention that we have several different series of webinars here at Kirkpatrick Price, and a lot of them now are available in recorded format on our website. So I definitely would recommend that you take a look at our Kirkpatrick Price website, go to resources and webinars to be able to view and download some of our past webinars in many of our series. So I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Jessie Skibby, and I am the Director of Compliance Services for Kirkpatrick Price. I have over actually 11 years now of industry experience in the receivables management industry. Most of you know me, if you've attended one of our webinars before, you know me as delivering a lot of the compliance webinars that we have here. And obviously in my role of Director of Compliance Services, that's what I really focus on. But what you may not know about me is that I have a really long career in information security as well. I've been a certified information systems security professional since about 2005, and that's really where I got my start in the industry. So I'm very, very excited about the topic we have for you today because like many of you that are out there responding to RFIs and information from prospects and clients existing, I was the one that was responding to those audits and trying to determine, for my company, what did we need to comply with and what types of certifications or audits that I want to get going forward. So definitely been in that position before, so it's very rewarding for me now to be on this side of the audit table, I guess, and helping clients through that process as well. So I'm very excited about what we're going to present to you today to help you navigate through this area. So who is Kirkpatrick Price? If you aren't familiar with us, we are, I'm going to throw some more letters at you. We are a licensed CPA, so we're a certified public accountant firm, as well as a PCI QSA. So we are a payment card industry qualified security assessor. We are qualified to do the PCI audits. So we've been providing assurance services to over 300 clients, many of them in the United States, as well as overseas and international. We have over 10 years of experience in information security, as well as, so we do both a readiness phase as well as audit in both information security as well as with regulatory compliance. So some more about us, some of the things that we do, as I just mentioned, from a consulting standpoint, guidance as well as audit, we pretty much cover the gamut as far as CAPB readiness and regulatory compliance, as well as information security. So all the letters that we're going to talk about today that are in the alphabet soup are things that we provide as an audit firm, covering SSA 16, SOC 2, PCI, HIPAA, FISMA, and as well as ISO. So I'd like to now introduce Todd Stevenson. Todd is the Vice President at Kirkpatrick Price. He's also an Information Security and Compliance Specialist. He holds the Certified Information Systems Auditor certification. He has spent the last 7 years helping organizations comply with their requirements, and including all of those that you see up there related to information security, as well as most recently the requirements being enforced by the CAPB. So welcome, Todd.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessie. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to sharing some of the information that I get asked about frequently with our audience today.
One thing, Todd, that I forgot to mention, I'm sorry to interrupt you already.
Yeah, no, go right ahead.
But so we're going to do this a little bit differently today because I'm moderating the event. So I would really like to encourage anybody who has a question about anything we're going to talk about today, if you could utilize the chat feature and send it to me directly. That way I can interrupt Todd like I just did, and we can ask a question and we can talk about it sooner versus later. So I definitely encourage you to go ahead and send me a question, and we will be glad to address that for you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Thank you, Jessie. So I am thrilled to be doing this today. Because we're an audit firm that does a wide variety of audits. We're qualified to do a number of these, well, all of the audits that you see on the slide here. I do get asked the question a lot, which one's right for me? Which should I pursue? Why would I do this one over the other? That sort of thing. And so I have this conversation a lot. So it's great to be able to provide the information to you as well today. So we are going to be attempting to help you make sense of the alphabet soup, if you will. We're calling it alphabet soup, as you know, because of all the acronyms, all the letters. But really, what do all these things mean? So let's kind of jump into it. One of the things where I want to start is some background. Why are you, as a service provider in particular, being asked for some of these third-party attestations? So let me just give you the regulatory background that drives these requests. So in 1996, we'll start there with HIPAA legislation. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act created several things, but one of the things it did with the security rule is mandate protection of personal health information, what is commonly called PHI. So, if a healthcare entity, is required to comply with this law, and you do business with that entity or do business with an entity that does, that's going to drive those requests. So. Then in 1999, the Graham-Links-Bliley Act was enacted, which was legislation primarily regulating the financial institutions, both traditional and non-traditional, but it mandates the protection of what we call PII, personal identifiable information. So financial institutions, therefore, by law, are required to protect that information, and that requirement extends to their service providers as well. So not much later, in 2002, Sarbanes-Oxley Act was enacted, which we're all familiar with, or most of us are, that requires publicly traded companies to have adequate internal control over any process that impacts their financial reporting. So whether it's IT systems or even an operational procedure, they have to have adequate internal control that would allow them to produce accurate financial statements to the shareholders. And again, that law extends not only to them as an organization, but to any service provider who has access to that data or could impact their financial statements as well. So you hear a lot of requests from publicly traded companies because of Sarbanes-Oxley. So then, in 2002, same year, the Federal Information Security Management Act, which is commonly referred to as FISMA, was enacted. FISMA requires the federal government to protect its information with a rigorous information security program. And of course, that law extends to anyone who has access to federal information. So it would be the federal government, contractors, and then even those subservice organizations. So again, that's ultimately what is driving the request for FISMA compliance. So 2004, this one is unique in that it's privately driven, but the payment card brands got together, formed an independent council that created and established a data security standard for the payment card industry, commonly referred to as PCI DSS. And this one, unlike the others, is not driven by regulatory law. It's driven through contractual agreement. So ultimately, those contractual agreements flow straight downhill from the payment card brands to the issuers themselves, then down to the merchants and service providers who have access to that credit card information. So that one is being driven contractually, but again, ultimately driving the PCI compliance requirement that you keep hearing about. So those are sort of the backgrounds. So ultimately, kind of breaking it down here on one slide for you, is that the GLBA and SOX legislations ultimately are the ones that are driving SSAE 16 and SOC 2. So those two acronyms of the alphabet soup, if you will, the SSAE 16 and SOC 2, ultimately, most frequently, not exclusively, but most frequently are being driven by the ultimately GLBA and Sarbanes-Oxley. So the publicly traded companies will be asking, the financial institutions will be asking their service providers, and of course, many times those service organizations will have to turn around and ask their service organizations as well. So the HIPAA third-party attestation is ultimately being driven by HIPAA legislation, which has been updated over the years multiple times. If you've watched it, it's been updated multiple times, but is still commonly referred to as HIPAA. And then the PCI Standards Council is ultimately the one driving. I wrote FISMA Audit, that's a mistake. PCI Standards Council is ultimately driving the PCI compliance requirement. The federal government, ultimately, the FISMA Management Act is what's driving the FISMA audit requirement. And I want to introduce the ISO here. And we're not going to talk as much about ISO, but I will, because it's ultimately international law that's driving the ISO requirement. ISO being a global information security standard and is utilized globally all over the world, is the premierly most readily recognized, the most respected international information security standard. So if you're doing business outside the U.S., you're certainly going to get asked about ISO compliance. So those are sort of what's the legislation and which audits they're ultimately driving. So let's get into it a little bit more. So the common theme here, what is the common theme from all the legislations and the PCI requirement that I mentioned earlier? And that is that the user organizations, which if you're a service provider means your client, the user organization must validate their service provider's compliance. Sarbanes-Oxley requires this, GLBA requires this, FISMA requires this, HIPAA, all of those legislations require that the service provider also have the same internal controls and same compliance requirements that the law requires that entity to have. And so they have two choices. They either have to validate compliance at the service provider directly, which means ultimately they're sending out questionnaires and doing on-site audits, or they can use an appropriate third-party audit to validate their service provider's compliance. So naturally, the big question is, what's appropriate? So it's really interesting. Back when Sarbanes-Oxley and GLBA was enacted, that was the question posed to the legislators. Well, what's an appropriate third-party audit? And at the time, the answer for both GLBA and SOX was SAS 70 at the time. SAS 70 is a known, acceptable third-party audit format. So once SAS 70 was given as a best practice, as a recommendation, quickly financial institutions and publicly traded companies, of course, standardized on SAS 70. And then in June of 2011, SAS 70 was retired and replaced with SSAE 16. So most financial institutions and publicly traded companies transitioned from SAS 70 and started asking for SSAE 16s. So again, the question being what's appropriate? Well, it depends who's asking. If it's, but it's usually going to be one of the acronyms. It's going to be one of the things that we're talking about today. So practically speaking, kind of when the rubber meets the road, kind of let me tell you what generally is happening in the marketplace. So who's asking for SSAE 16, which is also known as SOC 1. So if you're just hearing about SSAE 16 or you've heard SOC 1, just for everyone on the call today, SSAE 16 and SOC 1 are used synonymously. They are referring to the same audit format. So the publicly traded companies still consistently ask for SSAE 16. Financial institutions most commonly ask for SSAE 16. And it's worthy of note, both traditional and non-traditional financial institutions. So traditional banking, credit unions, community banks, but anyone providing financial services, so that, brokerage firms, mortgage lenders, et cetera. So, that extends down to any financial service being provided. And then state and local government, this is an interesting piece. Basically, and this is pretty universally true, that the state and local governments across the U.S. Saw that SAS 70 and SSAE 16 were being used as a standard and adopted those. So if you get an RFP or an RFI from a state or local municipality, typically you're going to see SSAE 16 as a RFP requirement. And it's certainly the most common means of attestation for service providers in the U.S. It's the most well-known. And there's some good reasons for that, which we'll talk about a little later. So who asks for SOC 2? Ironically, it's the same entities, publicly traded companies, financial institutions. It's finally becoming popular. So let me kind of tell you what happened, give you a background that'll kind of help you understand. So prior to 2011, everyone was using SAS 70 as a common practice to validate internal controls at a service provider. And it was being used for operational controls that relate to things like client financial reporting, for instance, but it was universally being used, or commonly being used, most commonly being used to validate information security as well. So the AICPA, who created SSA 16 and SAS 70, wanted to create an audit framework that was designed for technology companies, and they wanted to try to shift SSA 16 to be used primarily for operational, financial type controls. So they created an audit format in 2011 called SOC 2. So in June 2011, SSA 16 replaced SAS 70, and they simultaneously created a new audit format called SOC 2. It is designed primarily for those who are providing purely technology-related services. So the data centers of the world, the SaaS providers of the world, was their intention. So it's taken several years. Most everyone is comfortable with and familiar with SSA 16, and so they've continued to use it. It's finally kind of being adopted, and I'm hearing more and more clients get requests for SOC 2. But by and large, the SSA 16 is still more known and therefore more common. So we are kind of mentioned this. Who's asking you for HIPAA validation? Any entity who handles public, personal health information. So again, if you're working for a healthcare provider, or you're working for a business associate, meaning someone who services a healthcare provider, you're going to get asked for validation of your compliance with HIPAA. So, and this, again, this could be public or private company, doesn't matter. HIPAA applies to anyone handling PHI. So who asked for PCI? Well, we talked about this one as well. This is an interesting one. Jesse, you and I talked about this a little earlier, but PCI relates to ultimately payment card information. So ultimately, who's asking for it is the issuer, number one, the bank who handles your merchant account. So if you have a merchant account with XYZ Bank, they are contractually required with the payment brands through PCI to ensure that you are PCI compliant. And because they have to be contractually, now the merchant has to be contractually PCI compliant in the bank, so does anyone who, any service provider who has access to that data as well. So ultimately, that PCI requirement is being pushed down. So again, practically speaking, who's really asking for PCI validation, is particularly third-party audited PCI validation, and that's any client who's being audited for PCI compliance. If your client is having an annual PCI audit performed by a qualified security assessor, then there is a high degree of accountability there, and PCI specifically requires that they validate any vendor's compliance to PCI if they have access to that data. So ultimately, that's what's driving the PCI requirement. Now, Jesse, you and I talked about this a little bit earlier, and you asked the question, is that the only reason why people ask for PCI validation? And that's an interesting question. And the answer is no. There are other reasons, and it's very notable that, and this is happening more and more, where certain entities are choosing the PCI data security standard as their appropriate means to validate information security. Even though they may not be passing credit card data to their service provider, they may be asking for PCI compliance simply as a best practice. They see the PCI standard as a robust information security standard. They've chosen PCI as their vehicle to validate information security and are asking clients to be PCI certified, in fact, audited by a QSA as that vehicle, even though, again, the client has no access to credit card data. And this really gets confusing because particularly for service providers who don't store, handle, or transmit credit card data. They're providing a service that's unrelated to credit card data, and they don't actually, in fact, store any credit card data in their system. So they get online, they start Googling, they start reading, and they see PCI applies only to credit cards information, and I don't have credit card data. So they call their client and they say, well, we don't have credit card data, this doesn't apply to us. And what's happening there, again, is your client's asking for PCI certification, not because of PCI data, but because they like the standard. So they
one thing I
are
wanted to comment to, Todd, if you don't mind me just interrupting for a second. I mean, there's a definite difference between your client asking you to be PCI compliant versus being, PCI certified, the quote-unquote certified. We're going to talk more about this later, I believe, when we dig deeper into PCI. But definitely, I experienced this in my past position as an information security officer, having my clients asking me to be PCI compliant when I wasn't dealing with their credit card information. In fact, a lot of times I was dealing with an account number that wasn't, that was a masked number. It wasn't even a credit card number. But I also wanted to comment, too, when we do a lot of consulting and a lot of advisement on developing vendor compliance management programs, and I always tell the people I'm working with, adopt one of these standards as your own, and then, kind of you can push it down to your vendors, or at least have some expectation of what you want them to comply with. And PCI is a very, very robust information security framework. So whether it's you're going to do some testing on their PCI controls or have that third-party, qualified security assessor do it, it's a good framework to adapt, even if you're not dealing with credit card data.
Yeah, and that's been the position that many have taken, and you're right. And there's a great value as the user organization, as the creditor in this case, or the publicly traded entity, to adopt a standard, because that standard's being maintained, and then they can leverage the work that's being done there. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about PCI. Who asks for FISMA? Again, it's the federal government directly. So if you, for instance, you have a contract with the Department of Education to collect student loan, and you have access to that data, that student loan data, then the government's going to require you to be FISMA compliant. And if you're providing services for the person, the contractor who has the contract with the federal government, again, FISMA requires you to meet the FISMA requirements. So, and you would be considered the subservice provider in that case. So, again, more alphabet soup here, but just so you understand, FISMA is the law itself. NIST Special Publication 800-53 is the actual data security standard itself. It's the standard that actually lists the individual security controls. All right, so who asks for ISO? Generally speaking, it's customers doing business globally, because ISO is very well respected globally, and for good reason. It's a very mature, holistic information security standard. There's specialized pockets in the U.S., like Citibank's an example that uses it for their vendor compliance program. But by and large, it's not popular in the U.S. It's highly popular everywhere else. All right, so let's go ahead and kind of get into what are these particular audits and help kind of make sense of them. And the SSA 16 is probably the most misunderstood of the ones that we're talking about today. So I want to get a little bit more into this. So fundamentally, what is it? Well, an SSA 16 is an audit and report on the internal controls at a service provider. So the audit format was designed specifically for service providers who need to be able to report on internal controls that are operating in their organization that would impact their client's data. And those internal controls could impact their information security controls. Those internal controls could be related to their client's financial data. The internal controls could be related to operational type requirements or even compliance requirements. So again, any internal control that represents risk to their client could be audited within the scope of an SSA 16. It does have to be performed by a qualified CPA. This is another advantage of the SSA 16, is that you know that the audit's being performed by a certified public accountant, someone who has a professional education, licensing, and regulation around auditing. And it's the key thing here, and this is a common misunderstanding, is that it's relevant to your client's data, not your data. So an SSA 16 doesn't care about your financial statement if you're the service provider. It's concerned about controls that relate to your client's data. So whether or not you're protecting your own employee's Social Security number, for example, is not relevant to SSA 16. How well you're protecting the Social Security numbers that your client has given you, however, is highly relevant as an example. So a little bit more about SSA 16. So next slide there, Sarah. So here's a unique thing about SSA 16, and that is that it's risk-based. So if you get online again and you Google SSA 16 requirements, you will find no set standard of requirements with SSA 16, which is really frustrating, and frankly, you could get very confused very, very quickly. And that is because there is no such thing. The SSA 16 is risk-based. The idea is, as an organization, you do a risk assessment and you determine what are the risks to my client. Once I understand those risks, I then create objectives that are meant to mitigate those risks. Once I establish the objective, then I put controls in place, which are just policies and procedures, activities, to accomplish the objective. So, as an example, let's say I have a server in my office that has client data. One of the risks to that server is that a thief walks in the middle of the night, grabs that server, and walks out with it, right? That's a risk. So I create an objective. The objective is to prevent unauthorized physical access to IT systems. That's the objective. And then I'm going to establish controls. I'm going to establish locks on doors. I'm going to probably put video cameras in place, et cetera, right? I'm going to establish controls to accomplish that objective. And we're going to do that for all areas of risk relative to my client. So as you might imagine, as a service provider, the risks to one service provider, who's a data center, for example, are going to be different than the risks that a collection agency represents, or a payroll processor even. So again, SSA 16 allows a customized set of objectives that specifically relates to my service and my client's risks. So it's highly effective. So as an auditor, what's our job? If you hire KP or you hire another CPA firm to do an SSA 16, what's my job? Well, as an auditor, my job is to determine three things. Are the objectives appropriate? So we review the risk assessment. Is the risk assessment effective? Yes. Therefore, do the objectives match the risk assessment? Yes, they're appropriate. Okay, that's step number one. Number two, are the controls that you've designed to meet the objectives effectively designed? Will they accomplish the objective? I mean, are they good controls, in other words? And then number three, ultimately, is the service provider doing what they say they do? So if the good objectives, good controls, well then are they doing what they say they do? And you know, an SSA 16, a notable point here, and this is just the truth, is an SSA 16 is as good as its scope. If you create a great scope, an SSA 16 is a fantastic audit. If you created a very limited scope, then it's going to have limited use. So again, it depends on how the SSA 16 is scoped.
I like to think of the SSA 16 as a container, Todd. It's a container.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, it's what you put in the container needs to be appropriate to your environment. But I think, you know, until I kind of had it explained to me that way, it was really kind of a gray area. I think it still is for a lot of people. So I definitely think that, you helped clarify that.
Yeah, it is. In fact, if you pull that slide back up, Sarah, it'd be great. Yeah, the word I use, Jesse, is wrapper. It's really a wrapper.
Okay.
So SSA 16 defines how the audit's to be conducted. It defines what a good test of controls is in each case. It defines even the report format. It defines what an effective audit period is. So it's the rules about how you conduct the audit. So you're right, it's the wrapper, but the contents of the wrapper are customizable. Yeah.
Right.
All right, so let's talk about SOC 2. So SOC 2, as I mentioned, was created in June of 2011. It was specifically designed to report on one of 5 principles, security being the baseline. So it was recently updated in 2014. So in 2014, SOC 2 became a security framework fundamentally. So no matter what you do, you are audited against information security. And then essentially you have 4 other principles that you have the option to add to the audit, if you will. You can add availability, which is, are my systems going to be available to you? Covers things like backups and redundant power, et cetera. Confidentiality, are the people that are supposed to have access to this data have access to it, even internally at the organization. Processing integrity, how if you're a service provider who is doing some sort of transactions, what is the processing integrity? What controls do you have around that process to ensure its accuracy? And then privacy. Privacy, the irony here is the 4, security, availability, confidentiality, and processing integrity are, there's a lot of commonality. There are shared controls among those 4. Privacy is an audit all on its own. If you look at SOC 2, it is not commonly utilized in the U.S. So, Jesse, you think it would be helpful to talk more about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think what's important to talk about too, as I was thinking about when you were talking about this, Todd, was that this is the framework that we see the most kind of trending happening right now. We feel like there's more and more financial institutions that are seeing the value of this report, and it's something that we've been getting a lot more requests for the last even like 3 to 6 months. So, and I, as a former information security officer, I really appreciate the SOC 2 framework for multiple reasons, because it is defined. It's not as gray as the SSA 16. And it's very good from a business standpoint because you're looking at not only the information security controls, but you're looking at, the availability. So if you think about disaster recovery, business continuity, it's a testing of those controls, if availability is selected, as well as security. So it's a customizable, but it's a black and white framework that you can really get your hands around, versus, going out and getting an SSA 16 is a little bit more difficult to really wrap your head around. But this is a very black and white framework. It's definitely something that we see a lot more requests for right now.
Right. That's right. You're exactly right. It's finally being really adopted and embraced, and it's just now, I agree, been happening even just in the last few months. So I will say this because this is a commonly misunderstood thing, the privacy requirements. Privacy is all about the relationship with the end consumer and the entity that they're giving their data to. So in the case of a financial institution, for instance, they've got the relationship with the consumer. They're collecting the PII directly. And privacy is all about how they manage that data, how they communicate to the consumer, what they do with that data, giving the consumer the ability to elect to what their preferences are about how that data is used when it's not required by law, et cetera. So it's all about that end relationship with an entity. For a service provider who has a relationship with the entity and not the consumer directly, privacy is not typically relevant because you as a service provider don't have the direct relationship with the consumer, and so you don't disclose data, you don't have that direct relationship. The end user can't alter how you treat data, et cetera. So privacy is very uncommon for a service provider to utilize. By far the most common that are utilized are security, availability, and confidentiality for sure. Processing integrity being kind of next down a step down in terms of popularity. The clients that we audit processing integrity for would be clients, like for instance, a good example is clients that do imaging. They scan paper documents and index them and provide them as a some sort of hosted document management, for instance, where there's high processing involved and fields being generated, et cetera. What are their controls over processing integrity? So that would be an example, but by far security, availability, and confidentiality being the most common. And just like you mentioned, Jesse, it does have established criteria. So you're right, it's not fuzzy. Those criteria center around three main areas. Essentially, a SOC says, are your policies and procedures relative to the standard documented? How do you communicate those to all interested parties, internally and externally? And how do you monitor that those controls are being performed effectively? So the internal audit piece, and that's an overview. There's risk assessment in there, there's operations, there's subcategories, but that's the high level. And again, it does have to be performed by a qualified CPA. So again, it's being audited by an appropriate audit firm that has the professional background to do it.
The thing about this one too, Todd, and we talked a lot about scope for the SSA 16, but scope too for the SOC 2. I think what we see commonly is that we have a client that comes to us and says, I'm being asked for a SOC 2, and we say, okay, which of the five which of the five principles do you need, in that audit? Because that's really what kind of defines the scope here. And most commonly, it's, I don't know. It really wasn't something that was given to me specifically.
That's right.
It may come across in, a contract or an RFI, give me your SOC 2. But I think there needs to be more communication between the end user organization and the service organization. What exactly are you looking for? Which of the five principles is important? And I think that there should be more education on what those are and what's being asked for.
Yeah, that is so true. In the 100+ conversations I've had about which security principles are you being asked for, not one has ever said, oh, my client has specified security, availability, and confidentiality, for example. They've just said SOC 2. So if you're a service...
We had a question come in. Todd, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we had a really good question come in that I wanted to talk about. The statement is, from the individual is, I can foresee customers of a service provider requiring privacy controls anyway, even though they may communicate that it's not necessary. But any comment on how to communicate or substantiate that privacy controls under that scenario are irrelevant? How do they communicate, with their clients?
Right. Well, the key point would be that you, Mr. and I'm the service provider in this case. You, Mr. Client, have the privacy requirement, right, directly with the consumer, and you've got to follow your privacy policy. But ultimately, me as a service provider, you've got to validate that the things that I have in place meet your privacy requirements. But those requirements aren't privacy directly, they're security, confidentiality, right, and availability, meaning, so Mr. Client, you've got to notify the end user. I don't. That's a privacy requirement. But if you're storing your data with me, then it needs to be available to you in order to notify the client or the end consumer. If the consumer elects to change something, then I'm storing your data. Then again, it needs to be available to you. If you have a privacy statement with your client that says we don't disclose data to third parties, for instance, you need to ensure that me as your service provider don't disclose, but that's a confidentiality thing. We don't disclose the data. Again, so security and availability and confidentiality are actually the things at the service provider that enables the client to meet their privacy requirements. So that's essentially the concept that I would try to help the client understand. You need me to provide security and availability and confidentiality so that you can meet your privacy requirements. But because I don't have a direct relationship with the consumer, privacy is, in terms of SOC 2, not relevant, right? Well, that's how I would explain that. Okay, so let's go ahead and move to the next one. What is okay? Type 1 versus Type 2. So both the SSA 16 and the SOC 2 have two types. There's a Type 1 and a Type 2. So we're actually talking about 4 possible audits here, if you will. An SSA 16 can have a Type 1 and a Type 2, and a SOC 2 audit can have a Type 1 and Type 2. So there are actually 4 different types of audits. If your client asks you for a SSA 16 SOC 2 Type 2, I just want to say, because I've heard that many times, a number of times, from a number of different clients who ask that, and that's just a misunderstanding. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as an SSA 16 SOC 2 Type 2. What's happening there is they're confusing SOC 2 with Type 2. So, I just wanted to let everyone know there is such thing as a SOC 2 Type 2, and there's such thing as an SSA 16 Type 2, but not both, right? So hopefully that's helpful. But let me talk about Type 1 and Type 2. So a Type 1 is an audit as of one point in time. So what we're attesting to is that these objectives are appropriate, these controls will meet the objective, and in the case of a Type 1, we're saying those controls are operating as of this date. As of April 30, these controls were in place. We're not attesting to the day before or the day after. So there's a good deal of assurance there that the organization has implemented effective controls as of that date. What a Type 2 does is looks at the very same controls, only a period of time. So rather than looking to see that you have a background check policy and procedure in place and that all the employees are trained and it's been implemented, in the case of a Type 2, we're looking at a period of time, let's say at least 6 months and generally not more than a year. And we're saying how many new employees did you hire in that 6-month audit period? Oh, we hired 6. Okay, great. We need to see, 6 background checks, right? If it's 100, then we're going to take a sample. But we're validating that those controls have been operating over time effectively. So it's simply the same controls, but a much deeper look. So it's notable here to say that many companies who are new to either SOC 1 or SOC 2 will start with a Type 1 of either type. That allows them to go through a readiness period and implement the controls, and then they move to a Type 2 at a later date once they have a history of performing those controls. So that's a pretty typical transition period. And for the user organization, the financial institution or the publicly traded entity, the Type 1 says, hey, we've done a lot of work to put these controls in place and the organization's been trained. A Type 2 will allow them to go deeper and say, hey, these controls have become operational over time, or they haven't, and they need to make some changes. But regardless, the report will report on how effectively those controls have been implemented.
Todd, I have a question for you on this one. Is this most commonly come to our clients as specifics? Like, are they most likely asking for a Type 1 or a Type 2, or do most people are they not really sure which one they need?
Yeah, so this one, I either hear clients saying they didn't specify, they just said SSA 16, in which case, if the client doesn't specify Type 1 or Type 2, it's and generally speaking, it's safe to assume that Type 1 will meet their requirement. But just as many times as I hear that, I'll hear a client specify a Type 1 or Type 2, and usually it's Type 2. If the service that they represent is high risk, then the user organization, the client, if you will, is asking for a Type 2. So it's pretty common to hear a Type 2.
Yeah. I think we do. I mean, we do have on occasion some people coming to us and saying, I need an SSA 16 or I need a SOC 2 Type 2. I mean, that's kind of a good situation where we might do a 6-month audit period for the Type 2 versus the year. So depending on kind of the maturity and how long the controls are in place, a company could start off with a Type 2, but it may need to be the 6-month Type 2 versus the whole entire year.
That's right. That's exactly right. Usually if a client's new, but they have to meet the Type 2 requirement, they'll spend a period with us getting ready with some mentoring. They'll document and put controls in place, but then they'll have to go and create and follow those controls over a period of time, the 6 months, to build a good audit trail so that we can perform the Type 2. So the project just takes a little bit longer because of the need to create a good audit trail, right?
Right, and the maturity of the organization. Like, for example, if they've been following the ISO controls that we're going to talk about, or possibly they've been, PCI compliant for several years, they might be able to go comfortably into the Type 2. But that's something that we would talk about first.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jesse. Yes, if an organization is having an annual PCI certification done and a report on compliance done by a QSA, then they've probably got good discipline around information security, and you could have a Type 2 performed immediately. Again, a Type 2 is always looking in the rear. So when you perform a Type 2, you're always looking back, either 6 months or a year or 9 months, but it's always a backward look. So by the time you get a Type 2 report, by the way, it's always looking backwards. And yes, if there's good discipline, then there's no challenge with getting a Type 2 performed looking back immediately, because if you've got good audit trail, then that's not a challenge. Okay. So let's go ahead and hit the next slide. So a HIPAA audit. So the key thing with a HIPAA is around protected health information. Again, so what's the audit over? Well, legislation requires appropriate physical, administrative, and technical safeguards. HIPAA is a lot like SSA 16 in that it's risk-based. You as an organization have the requirement of HIPAA is first to perform the risk assessment, determine what those appropriate physical, administrative, and technical safeguards are, and then you have to implement those. So there is not a hard list of requirements for HIPAA. And there is, just so everyone knows, there's no such thing as a HIPAA certification. There is the law and the requirements, and then you need to be compliant with those, and you can hire an audit firm like us or another one to do an assessment of the controls in your organization and give their opinion as to their effectiveness to meet the HIPAA legislation, which is what a HIPAA, third-party HIPAA audit would be. But there's no official certification for HIPAA. Similarly to, even if you're familiar with some of the CFPB enforcement, areas of enforcement, they have an exam guide. You can audit to those exam procedures, but there is no CFPB certification, right? HIPAA is a similar scenario. So next slide, Sarah. So what's a PCI audit? Well, it's an information security audit focused on the protection of credit card data. It's performed by a PCI qualified security assessor, and that's a defined list. You can determine if the audit firm is a qualified security assessor by the council. There's approximately 212 controls. I'll just tell you, the audit firm now under PCI 3.0, soon to be 3.1, has to perform 1,000 tests. We have to create 1,000 work papers in order to fill out a report on compliance, which is known as a ROC, R-O-C, ROC. There are 6 control objectives with 12 subject areas, and when you have a third-party audit performed, the result is a report, on compliance. So on the next slide, I show what those 6 control objectives are and the 12 requirements.
I have a question, Todd, that we were asked by one of the attendees, and I'm not sure if right now is the time to ask it or not. But in regards to PCI quote-unquote certification, I mean, that also, the thing that I most commonly see people not really understanding what that means, but that really means that they receive their report on compliance. But
that's right.
What does it mean when people talk about the levels of PCI compliance? Like if they say, what level should I be? Are we going to talk about that later, or is now a good time for that?
Yeah, no, this is the time. Great question. So this is, I get this question a lot. So I get a call from a service provider, and they're being required to be PCI certified. And you're right. What certified means is that we've hired a qualified security assessor, and they're performing an audit and issuing a report on compliance. A ROC, if you will, is the quote-unquote certification in that point. And certifications used accommodatively here. So and so they'll call me and say, Todd, I've been asked to be, PCI audited, but I got online and I Googled, and, there's these 4 levels, and we only do, 200,000, transactions a year, or less than 1 million, and which makes us level 3, and and only level 1 requires an audit, so I don't understand why my client's asking me, for this audit. So And here's what I help them understand, and this is hopefully will be helpful to everyone on the call today, and that is that there are two types of PCI compliance. One is as a merchant. So that's you collecting credit card numbers for payments to your organization. So you have a relationship with an issuing bank, you have a merchant account, and the bank requires you to be PCI compliant for the credit cards that you collect. And there are 4 levels. So the payment card brands are slightly different. Visa's is different than American Express's, for instance, but I'll use Visa's since it's the most common. So if you do 20,000 transactions a year or less, you're level 4. If you do 1 million, between 20,000 and 1 million, you're level 3. And if you do between 1 million and 6 million, you're level 2. You have to do over 6 million transactions a year in order to be level 1. And Visa only requires level 1 merchants to be audited by a QSA. All other levels self-certify. And that's so here again, the confusion. I'm a merchant. I collect credit card numbers, but Todd, we don't even collect 1 million. I'm level 3. Why am I being asked? Well, that's because your client is not asking you to be certified as a merchant. They're asking you to be certified as a service provider, which is the other category. So if you are receiving credit card data or from your client, let's say you're collecting on delinquent credit card debt, for instance, or you're a data center and your client's servers are processing their credit card transactions, for instance, and they do over 6 million transactions a year, for instance, you as the service provider don't need to be certified as a merchant. You have to be certified as a service provider. And here's the bad news. All service providers have to be level 1 compliant. So whether you even collect credit card numbers for your own purposes are irrelevant in this case. Your client's asking you because you're a service provider, and that automatically makes you level 1, which means you have to be audited by a QSA. So that's what's driving that requirement. So hopefully that helps. Do you think that was helpful, Jesse? I mean, did that answer your question?
Absolutely, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, great. So let's get to the last few slides here before we close up today. So a FISMA audit is a thorough assessment of your information security practices as it relates to NIST Special Publication 800-53. The National Institute of Standards and Technology created an information security standard, again, which is what the Federal Information Security Management Act requires. So it is just a little bit about it. It involves a detailed risk assessment, a selection of controls. The control list is pretty comprehensive. In FISMA, the big relevant question is which category? Am I low, medium, or high category? Most commonly is a medium category. You know, you're not going to get classified as a high category unless you're working directly for the Department of Defense, for instance. You know, if you're on the department, if you are working with the Department of Education, for instance, or for Fannie Mae or something, you know, you're going to be required to be compliant at the moderate category, and your service providers will have to be moderate category. So, and low, moderate, high just means it just determines the list of controls that you have to be compliant with. Low has the least number of controls. Moderate obviously is moderate, and high meaning the most highest level of controls. And FISMA, by far, of the audits that we've talked about today, is just the most difficult. It's the most demanding, ironically, of all the audits that we've talked about today. So, and I'll be available.
Very specific from a documentation standpoint. It's very specific. Yeah. So.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And
actually, Todd, we have a question regarding HIPAA. If you don't, I don't know if we're going to get back to that or not, but I know we're getting kind of short on time. But there was a question that came out that was a really good question. As far in relation to HIPAA, is it recommended? What are your thoughts on the HITRUST certification?
Yeah, so HITRUST is interesting. So HITRUST is an organization that's put together their own framework based on the standard, and created a certification, if you will, based upon that. So it's a third-party certification, if you will. It's not a HIPAA certification. They've created their own. So, you know, it's a good list of controls, right? I mean, they've taken the standard of the legislation, they've put together a good list of controls, and then then organizations have to meet those controls in order to get the high trust certification. And it is one valid way to validate your HIPAA compliance. It just happens to be one of the ways that you can do that. So. I could say more about that, but the interesting thing about it is it's just never been popular. When it was first created, there was a lot of talk about it, and over the last several years, I just virtually never get a request for it. I think the biggest reason for that is that they charge a lot of money to use their criteria, which any valid party could create, but they charge a lot of, there's a lot of cost associated with using their particular framework, and I believe that's the main reason why it's not popular.
So it's basically a choice, and there's no requirement for high trust certification. It's just another choice in meeting HIPAA compliance. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. It's just one of your options to validate your HIPAA compliance by a third party, right? There's no connection between HIPAA legislation and high trust, right? Directly, right? Yeah, it's a voluntary thing. Okay, so what's the next? All right, ISO. So ISO is frankly very similar to NIST. It's just a holistic information security program. The main thing, for the sake of time, that I want to key in on is a common misunderstanding. So ISO 27001 versus 27002. So let me help you understand. The 27001 is the entire management system. So those of you who are on the call that have gotten real familiar with the term CMS or compliance management system relative to compliance management, you know, the program, the implementation, the internal audit, the continual improvement, you know, the system itself. 27001 is the same exact concept with information security. So 27001 is the management of information security and the controls themselves, the individual controls, like you have to have background checks and locks on doors, right, and use antivirus as examples. So that's the entire system. It's the big umbrella that includes the smaller umbrella, which is the controls themselves. 27002 is the small umbrella. It's only the controls. So it's just the list of requirements of physical security and logical security and administrative security and information security policy. And it includes things like backup and disaster recovery and business continuity, for instance. It's just the controls themselves. And 27001 is the bigger umbrella, which is the management of all of that as well. So I know there's a lot of confusion out there, so just want to help you understand what the difference is between those two references. So next slide, Sarah. Okay, so I think this is my last slide for me, at least, to talk and make some points. So three things that I think would be help to tie some of this together. One is SSA 16. So it's the only established audit standard or framework which allows audit scope expansion. That's its greatest strength is I can report on my information security controls, and I can report on these critical operational controls to my client, and I could even use it to report on my compliance controls, whether it's HIPAA or a federal consumer financial protection law, for instance. It's the wrapper, and I can include all relevant controls to my client and have them audited by a third party. Whereas with SOC 2 or PCI, for example, it's only security and availability, for instance, or confidentiality, et cetera, of SOC 2. I can't add compliance controls to a SOC 2 that it's defined, right? So that's its greatest strength. SOC 2 is just a well-balanced general information security standard. It's great. It takes into account not only information security, but like Jesse mentioned, availability. So what are you doing from a business continuity perspective, for instance, and also confidentiality. How are you restricting business need to know to all data, not just credit card data, for instance. And that brings my point to PCI. It's a very robust, respected information security standard, But its weakness is it's only concerned with credit card data, number one. It's very myopic in that way. It doesn't care about any other data. And for an example, it doesn't cover disaster recovery. Again, Visa doesn't care if you lose the credit card number because it can't be used fraudulently if it's burned down. So again, PCI audit will not review disaster recovery or any kind of business continuity or any kind of availability controls. So again, if you're doing PCI and your client cares about availability, then they're not going to get that with PCI. So I think that kind of helps you get a sense of some of the strengths and weaknesses of the different audit formats. So I think our next slide is just a little bit about us.
So Jesse, I'll let you can take a breath now, Todd.
Thank you.
So why work with us? Well, first of all, we're great people, but second of all, we have a wealth of industry experience as well as audit experience. We have senior level auditors that would be working with you directly. I think the one thing I really wanted to key on here too is our online methodology, allowing for the mapping of these different frameworks we talked about. We have our online audit manager portal that we use that's very, very effective in our audit process, because I know that many of you out there are not just asked for one of these, you're asked for multiple. So if you're asked for an SSA 16 and a SOC 2, and you're also asked to be PCI compliant, well, our audit manager maps those common controls. So it's very much an answer once, respond to many type of system. So we definitely try to make it easy for you and easy for us through the audit process. It means that we try to save you as much money as possible. So that's definitely one of the reasons why you should work with us. One of the last things I wanted to say is, we try to provide a lot of resources for you. I mentioned earlier our website with the previous webinars that we provide. We also have a blog that we're very excited about. Recently on our blog, if you haven't checked it out, I think you need to go to the next slides here too, yeah. So here's the web address to get to our blog, and we've got some great information on there. Most recently, we've been focusing on the Anthem security breach. We have some latest updated news on HIPAA compliance and the OCR activity. We also have some really great resources out there, and I would have loved this several years ago when I was in the position of managing this process, but we have our 5-step approach to completing a formally documented risk assessment, including some downloads for some, with some tools to help get you started. So definitely subscribe to our blog, check out our website. We're continually trying to publish information to help you through this process. So I wanted to thank everybody for attending today. This is just one of the many series that we have ongoing, so we'll be announcing our next webinar very shortly. If you have any other questions, I know we had several during the session we were able to get to, but if you have any other further questions or would like to reach out to Todd, his email address and his telephone number is listed there for you on the last slide. And one of the questions we always get is, will this be available? And yes, absolutely. During the, when you get your thank you for attending email, you'll also get a link to be able to go and download the presentation for more information. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Todd. Sorry we ran a couple minutes over. All right, thank you, everyone, for attending. That's all for today.